Hello and welcome to this taster lecture on economics. My name is Amrit Amirapu. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Kent in economics. And I'm a researcher. I do research in microeconomics and development economics, and I'm very lucky because I get to teach in exactly those areas. I teach a stage 2 course in microeconomics and a stage 3 course in development economics. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got into economics. I didn't study it at university, so I want to talk a little bit about how I got interested in it. And then I'll talk a little bit about what economics is and what you can do with it. And I'll talk a little bit about what development economics is, my main area of research. I'll give you a short primer on that. So I went to university in the U.S. I studied physics and philosophy. I wasn't really. I took an economics class in the first semester of my freshman year, and my stage 1 year, and I hated it. And I think it's because there were a lot of misunderstandings I had about it, and I didn't get interested in it until the last year of university, when the father of a friend of mine who is an economist, and who would later go on to be the chief economic advisor to the government of India, he came to my university and he gave a talk. And one of the things that he talked about, which I'll never forget, is he talked about the history of South Korea. And he mentioned that in South Korea in 1960, the GDP per capita, you can think of that basically as the average income of the country, in 1960 was about $1,000. And that's much poorer than a country like India is today, a currently poor country. It's about as poor as India was in the 1990s. And then what happened in South Korea is that South Korea, for the next 4 decades, grew at about 7% per year. Its economy, its GDP per capita, grew at about 7% every year. And when you're growing at 7% per year, when anything is growing at 7% per year, whether that's an economy or a bacteria colony, that means it's doubling every 10 years. So after 10 years, from 1960 to 1970, the average income's doubled. In the next 10 years, they doubled again. So they went from 1 to 2 to 4, then they doubled again to 8, and then in the 4th decade, they doubled again to 16. So that by the year 2000, the average income in South Korea, the GDP per capita, was more than 16 times what it had started at. And growth in South Korea has more or less continued, not quite as rapidly, but still, it has still continued. And today, South Korea is comfortably a rich country. It's a little less rich than Japan, a little bit more rich than Italy and Spain. So it's comfortably a first world country. If you go there, you'll see that. So something happened in a single generation, lifting people from extremely low standard of living, what we would all agree is a level of extreme poverty, to basically first world status. And once I realized that was possible within a single generation, I became captivated by that possibility. I myself was born in India. I grew up in Nigeria as well as the U.S. and the U.K. And I kept thinking about whether there was something that the government of Nigeria or the government of India could do to make their economies grow in this way and wipe out poverty. And this is, of course, all possible. South Korea is able to do this because of the magic of compounding growth. South Korea was growing at 7% per year, so its incomes were doubling every 10 years. The U.S. and the U.K. until recently have been growing at about 2% per year for the last 100 years or so. And at that rate, your economy is doubling every 35 years. So economies grow at different rates. In the UK, growth has really slowed down since 2008. So this is a big country, and growth is not automatic. And it's really important for us to understand, why countries grow, how to make them grow faster, and that sort of thing. So that's how I got interested in economics. Once I learned about that, I started on a path to doing what I do now. So the next thing I want to tell you about is, what I think economics is really all about. And people disagree about this. There are many people who think of economics as basically the study of prices and markets. If you study economics if you studied before, you've probably heard that economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. And that's not a bad definition. But I would go even further, and I would say that economics is really the study of human behavior. And in that, it's similar to all of the other social sciences. All of the social sciences study human behavior, but what distinguishes them is how they do it. And one of the things that one of the ideas that I'm borrowing from Larry Samuelson, an economist at Yale, is that we can think of economics. I think we can think of one of the defining methods, perhaps the defining method of economics, as the following kind of a perspective. We all share, most economists share the perspective that we can get a lot of insight from thinking about agents. Agents can be individuals, they can be households, they can be firms or firm owners, they can be shareholders, CEOs, they can be governments, they can be politicians, they can be warlords, they can be just about anything. So we can get a lot of insight from thinking of agents as having fairly stable preferences, facing certain constraints, and then optimizing to get to maximize their preferences under those constraints. And this sort of optimization process involves a little bit of mathematics. It's not an excessive amount, but there's a little bit of mathematics that is involved. And if you haven't studied math at A levels, rest assured that's not necessary to study economics at many universities, including the University of Kent. What you need is comfortable background in math at the GCSE level, and then everything else can be picked up at university. So that's what I think economics is really about. Many people sort of come in thinking that it's about money or about business, and I don't think that's right. I mean, money can be a part of it, but it doesn't have to be. You can do a lot of economics without thinking about money at all. It's really about human behavior. So once you develop the tools that are taught in an economics program, what can you do with it? Well, there are certain things that can help you understand. So for example, some of the big things that can help you understand is it can help you, for example, understand how people or businesses would respond to a change in government policy. So for example, let's say the government is thinking about changing taxes or closing down schools to prevent the transmission of a pandemic. People are going to respond to that in certain ways, some of which may be obvious, some of which may not be so obvious. And economic modeling can help think through what those likely responses are going to look like. Then you can go further than that, and you can try to understand and estimate the impact of certain policies on people's welfare. So you can say, okay, if I were to close schools, what's the impact on welfare going to be? If I don't, what's the impact on welfare going to be? There's clearly going to be costs both ways. Or you can go in the reverse direction and say, okay, there's a certain behavior that I want to encourage. Maybe I want people to quit smoking, or I want them to, go to university or something like that. And then you can work backwards to say, what's the policy that's best going to bring about that behavior? And you can apply this sort of standard toolkit to a very wide range of questions. So these are all, I have an example, I have a list here of different types of topics. And in gray, these are some recent examples of academic research papers published by sort of randomly some of the researchers here at the University of Kent in the economics department. So, economists, including those at Kent, have done research on the way that families and households work, including studying how marriage markets work in developing countries. They've studied the role of social networks in our lives. They've studied decisions of politicians in democracies and dictatorships. They've studied conflict, the causes and effects of conflict, climate change, resource scarcity, corruption, racism, prostitution, drug use, crime. All of these are sort of topics that are amenable to study by economists using economic tools. So that's all fairly abstract. What about on the job market? Well, I can think of at least two clear reasons why, if I were an employer, I would want to hire an economics graduate. One has to do with data analysis. And if you study economics, you'll study courses including statistics and econometrics. And the basic idea in these courses and in data analysis generally is to try to understand relationships between different things or variables in the world. So very often we're interested in understanding the causal effect of one thing on another thing. For example, I'm a government, I'm thinking about raising taxes. What is the effect of my raising taxes going to be on tax collection or on firm behavior, hiring, etc. Or maybe I'm an employer and I want to get people to come back to work instead of working from home. If I were to institute a policy forcing people to do that, what are the costs and benefits going to be? Now, if you're in the natural sciences, very often you can answer questions of the form, what is the effect of one thing and another, by running an experiment. But in the social sciences, it's much harder to do that. It's difficult to run an experiment where you randomly vary tax rates. Most politicians would probably not survive re-election if they tried to do something like that. So when you can't do experiments, when people are the subjects, how do you learn about the effects of certain things and other things? And that's what statistics and econometrics is all about. And having skills like that can be extremely useful on the job market, whether you're working for the government, for the private sector, for academia, for NGOs. If you're in the private sector, you want to know you were thinking about a marketing campaign. What is the effect of this marketing campaign going to be on increasing sales? That's exactly this kind of question. So that's one sort of general area where students in economics should learn some valuable skills, which would be useful to an employer. And the other one, even more general, is that economics improves your ability to think analytically and to problem solve. For a long time, this was a long-held belief of mine. I didn't have evidence about it, but I felt strongly that studying certain subjects, including economics, would improve your analytical thinking. I think that's true, not only of economics, but certainly of other subjects. But for a long time, I didn't really have clear evidence about this until I came across this paper, which was published a few years ago by Dender, Orlov, and Rufa-Gallas. And that paper was called, Do Economics Courses Improve Students' Analytical Skills? So this is exactly the question they tried to answer, and it's an example of data analysis and trying to estimate causal effects. So they want to know, if you take an economics course, does it have a causal impact on improving your analytical skills? And that can be a difficult thing to do. If you can't run an experiment, if you can't sort of randomly vary who takes economics courses, what could you do? Well, you could compare the analytical skills of students who take economics courses with those who don't. But that's not going to be great, because the types of students who study economics are going to be systematically different from the types of students who don't study economics, who study other things. And maybe it's one of those underlying differences that explains any differences you observe in analytical skills. That's the general problem that you face, and it's often the problem that you face when you're trying to estimate the causal effects of things. So one way to get around this, one of the tools that you might learn about in an econometrics class is a process called differences in differences, DID. And the general idea there is, instead of comparing analytical skills between two groups of people at one point in time, what you do is you take a comparison of those analytical skills before students have taken any courses to get a baseline sense of what the differences in analytical skills were between these two populations of students, those who took economics courses and those who didn't, and then you measure them again afterwards and you look at the change. So what these researchers did is they took students who, before they had taken any courses, they measured their analytical skills, and they saw that there may have been differences in the analytical skills of students who took economics versus others. But those didn't have to do with the courses they'd studied, because they hadn't taken any courses yet. So they were able to basically partial out those underlying differences, and then they looked and measured their analytical skills after they'd studied courses. And they subtracted the initial difference from the difference at the end, and they found that some students improved their analytical skills more than others. Taking any university course tends to improve your analytical skills. But if you take an economics course, it turns out that you get about a 15% increase in your analytical skills versus only about an increase which is about half that big for other non-economics courses. So in that way, you can argue that, look, it's not just that students who tend to take economics have more analytical, are more prone to analytical thinking than other students. It's that there's something about taking an economics course that actually causes you to improve your analytical thinking skills faster than if you hadn't. So that's, I think, pretty strong evidence that there is a causal effect of taking economics on analytical skills. Then, one thing that you might be interested in knowing is, okay, well, that's all well and good, but what about the effect on my earnings? The IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, has looked into this. They have tried to estimate the effect on your earnings of studying different subjects at university in the UK. So this is a study that was put out a few years ago. It's one of the best ones of this kind. This is also a very difficult question to answer. You know, it has a similar problem to the one that we were just discussing. You want to know, okay, like what is the causal effect of studying economics versus, let's say, psychology going to be on my earnings? Well, you can't just compare the earnings of students who have studied economics with psychology, because again, those students are going to be systematically different. The types of students who choose to study economics are going to be different than the ones who don't. So the IFS basically did something similar, a type of difference in difference, using a ton of data, using information on students from well before they went to university, including GCSE scores, to do something like a difference in difference, to try to estimate the effect of actually studying certain subjects. And those are plotted here. The little red dots plot the effect of studying different subjects. And you see that for men, studying economics leads to higher average income, you know, at age 29, so several years after leaving university. There's a higher effect on your earnings than studying any other subject. Now that's an average effect. It's, you know, it hides a lot of variation, but that's the average. For women, the effect is even larger. For men, it was about a little bit short of 40%, 35%, and for women, if you study economics versus not going to university at all, your average earnings are looks like it's about 60% higher than they would be otherwise. Now, for women, you could earn even more by studying medicine, but economics is still the second most lucrative subject you can study using this measure. And of course, money is not everything, but it is seems to be a fact that on average, studying economics leads to higher rates of return on your earnings. Studying economics is, I think, a fascinating subject. There are a lot of interesting different types of questions you can study with it, and it's a good financial investment, or tends to be. So with that out of the way, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the subject that is sort of nearest and dearest to my heart, which is development economics. I told you how I got into economics. It sort of began with this development story. I was born in a poor country. I was born in India, grew up in partly the US, partly the UK, and partly Nigeria. So I've always been interested in the main questions of development economics. And the main question of development economics is really, why is it that some countries are so much richer than other countries? So for example, the GDP per capita in the US is almost 100 times greater than it is in a country like Somalia. How is that possible, that living standards are 100 times higher in one country than another country? How did this happen? How does development occur? How does a country like South Korea go from poor to rich in a single generation? And what can be done to improve the welfare of those living in poor countries? Those are the main questions in development economics and the main questions that motivate development economists. What I want to do now is I want to just introduce you to some basic facts in development economics. So the first fact is that until fairly recently, nearly everyone was poor. So when you go back more than a couple centuries, average living standards everywhere, in every part of the world, and including in this one, were extremely low. So if you're reading Jane Austen and you're reading about Mr. Darcy and he's sipping tea and whatever, he's living in a place where more than 90, something like 95% of the population are living in agricultural areas under conditions of dire poverty. At subsistence levels with very low life expectancy, with very high child mortality, with very low living standards. There were periods in which there was great wealth. These are the things that you read about in your history classes. You read about the Roman empires and the Persian empires and medieval Europe. There is great wealth, but that wealth has always been extremely concentrated in a tiny sliver of the population. And it wasn't until a couple centuries ago that average incomes started to go up, and those incomes started to be enjoyed by more than a tiny sliver of the population. And the something special that happened right here in this country with the Industrial Revolution. So the UK has an extraordinarily unique role to play in the the trajectory of global economic history. This is where income started to go up in a secular way and affect the living standards of more than just a tiny sliver, just the Mr. Darcy's. So that's fact one. Until the 18th century, nearly everyone in every part of the world was poor. Something changed a couple centuries ago, roughly speaking. There's a lot of argument about when exactly things started to change. So fact number two, over the last couple hundred years, corresponding to the time when average income started to go up globally, the global incidence of extreme poverty has been declining. In other words, the poverty rates have been declining. If you go back 200 years, depending on what measure of poverty you use, whether it's $1 a day or $2 a day or whatever, about 90% of the population globally were living in conditions of extreme poverty with less than $1 a day. And now the fraction of people living under those conditions has fallen dramatically. By some estimates, we're talking 20% of the population. So that is an extraordinary change in global human welfare, and something that ought to make us, very optimistic and proud of humanity's achievements. Now, the other interesting thing is that not only has the poverty rate, the incidence of extreme poverty, been declining, it's been declining so fast that even the poverty head count has been going down. In other words, even the number of people living in poor. And this is surprising because the population has been growing. From 1 billion people, it's gone up to now 8 billion people. And given that the number of people who've been living has been increasing, you might expect that the number living in extreme poverty has also been increasing. But that's not been the case. The number of people living in extreme poverty has been going down because the poverty rate has been going down so fast. Now, these trends of poverty reduction have been extremely different, from region to region. If you go back, to the 1980s, you would say that global poverty was really an Asian problem. Most global poverty was in East Asia and South Asia. And what happened through the extraordinary growth of countries like Indonesia and China and other East Asian countries, and Vietnam recently, extreme poverty is becoming more and more rare in East Asia. And in recent decades, it started to go down a little bit, though not nearly as fast in South Asia. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it hasn't decreased enough to offset global population growth. And therefore, in that part of the world, the number of people living in extreme poverty has actually been going up. So there are very different trends on how poverty has been looking by region. So to summarize, developing countries, which began with all countries, have made a lot of progress over the last few centuries and the last few decades in alleviating extreme poverty. That's something to really celebrate. The implications on human welfare are staggering. But we're very far from being able to declare mission accomplished. Why not? Well, one, progress has not been ubiquitous. There are certain parts of the world where the trends are going in the wrong direction. Two, extreme poverty, which is what all these charts have been showing you, is a very low bar. You can have more than $1 a day, but still live with extremely low living standards, and that's that's still something which we need to care about. We need to improve. Three, climate change. Climate change is having the largest impacts on the poorest countries. The countries nearest the equator are the countries that tend to be the poorest for a number of reasons. And those countries that are nearest the equator, those are the ones that are experiencing the biggest changes in average temperatures, the biggest increase in volatility of temperatures, in extreme weather events, extreme temperatures, droughts, flooding, hurricanes, and other events. And these countries, of course, are precisely the ones that have done the least to bring about climate change. So why is climate change happening? Certainly caused by man. It's certainly caused by contribution of emissions such as CO2. Those have disproportionately been generated by the currently rich countries like the UK and the US. And we are the countries, the US and the UK and other Western countries, are precisely the countries where climate change is having the least negative effects compared to the poorest countries. Now, it's having negative effects in rich countries too, but the effects in poor countries are much more severe. And not only are they more severe, poor countries have the least resources and state capacity to address those. So I think there's a big climate justice issue to think about. And of course, things are just getting started. The negative impacts of climate change are just going to become more severe as we go forward. Then the fourth reason not to feel content is COVID-19. For the first time in many, many decades, global poverty actually increased starting in 2020. Why? Because of the COVID pandemic and the policy responses and the lockdowns, etc. They were disastrous for countries all over the world, rich and poor countries alike, but especially for poor countries. And then it's had lingering, after effects. Countries like Sri Lanka, which were seriously financially adversely affected and continue to suffer from those effects. And then the last reason to be sort of vigilant and concerned and to think hard and to work hard to improve development going forward is a phenomenon called premature deindustrialization. So historically, every country that is currently rich has done through a process of industrialization. All of the resources in the society begin in agriculture. 90% of people working in agriculture, 90% of the economy depending on agriculture. And what has happened in every country that is currently rich is that resources have been transferred from agriculture to industry, with sometimes 30, 40, 50% of the working population in manufacturing. And then there's been a process of deindustrialization where resources, workers, capital move from industry to services. And now all the rich countries in the world, the US, the UK, these are services-led economies. Our economies depend on services, not on manufacturing or agriculture. And this process whereby resources go from agriculture to manufacturing to services, this has been a very reliable pattern. Historically, every rich country has seen this, but it seems that this process is getting more difficult for poor countries to achieve. Manufacturing jobs are disappearing globally, especially the low-skill manufacturing jobs, the ones that poor countries are able to access because they have low levels of education. So manufacturing, these jobs are disappearing. Manufacturing jobs are disappearing globally, and what that means is that poor countries are starting to peak in their manufacturing levels earlier, so their industrialization is being interrupted, and they're starting to deindustrialize before they even industrialize in the first place. And this might have very negative consequences for how growth occurs and what it looks like going forward. This is not well understood, and I think this is one of the things that might be a big problem going forward. So those are all the reasons why I think that's sort of the state of the world and the state of development in terms of how I see it going forward. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this brief primer on development economics. And then economics generally. And thanks very much. Hope to see you at the University of Kent next year.